Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kara, and today's topic is going to be 15 tips for writing a winning offer on a home when there are multiple offers. The housing market is very difficult for buyers right now. It's probably one of the hottest sellers markets we have seen, but there are some ways to make your offer stand out to a seller and be more likely to get accepted. So tip number one is, if you are financially able to, I would recommend purchasing a home in all cash. All cash offers are the most attractive to sellers, and the saying goes, cash is king. I know that this really isn't feasible for a lot of buyers, especially first-time home buyers, so your next best bet if you cannot purchase a home in all cash is to get a conventional mortgage. And I could do a whole other video on the pros and cons of different types of mortgages, but for the purposes of this video, just know that a conventional loan is the most attractive to a seller, and honestly there are many benefits to you as a buyer as well. It tends to be the best case for both sides of the transaction. Tip number two is looking at the comparable homes in the area compared to the home you're looking to purchase and making an offer based on those comps. Because of the very competitive market that we are in right now, I would recommend offering the highest price that you feel comfortable with. What I always tell my clients is go in at the price where you won't wish you had gone higher later. So in other words, if someone ends up getting the house and they end up paying $1,000 or $2,000 more and you end up losing out on the house, I don't want you to think, wow, I would have paid that extra $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever amount it is over your offer price. I'd rather have you say, well, you know what? They got the house, I wouldn't have paid that price anyways, we'll move on in the next one. And it makes the process a lot less painful. Tip number three is offering a significant amount for due diligence. So if you are not located in North Carolina or in Asheville, you may have no idea what I'm talking about. But here in North Carolina, we are a due diligence state. And what that means is that upon acceptance of your offer, you give the seller a due diligence amount, and that is not refundable to you. So if you end up backing out of the contract due to something that comes up in inspections, or you just change your mind about the house, whatever it is, you do not get this amount back. This is very important to understand, and that is what separates it from earnest money. But due diligence amount is still very important. It's not a requirement for an offer, but in the market that we are in currently, it is strongly recommended. I have seen due diligence amounts in multiple thousands of dollars. Honestly, I've seen them even like $10,000, but I'm not here to tell you exactly what amount to put down. That's different depending on what your market is, what your price range is, how competitive the market is where you are, and a bunch of different factors. But I would say definitely speak to your real estate agent or broker and talk to them about what a good due diligence amount might be. What I would recommend personally is put an amount down that you are able to part with. So if you put down $5,000, you end up going under agreement, know that you're not going to get that $5,000 back if you back out. And I want you to be okay with that. Not that it's a great thing to be losing that money, but it is a very important part of the offer process these days. Step number four is related to step number three, and that is putting down a significant amount for your earnest money deposit. So as I mentioned, due diligence is not refundable. However, earnest money is, as long as you are still within your due diligence period. So this amount would be due to the seller typically within 3 to 5 days of going under agreement. It's something that's held actually at the title company or attorney's office until settlement, where it's applied to your numbers. Due diligence is also applied to your numbers if you make it to settlement too. But for earnest money, I usually recommend anywhere between 1 to 5% of the purchase price. It's really up to you, again, what you're comfortable with. Some people even will do 2 due diligence amounts. So there's one part that would be due, again, 3 to 5 days after going under agreement, and another part that would be paid after the due diligence period is over. So you could have due diligence amount, earnest money number 1, earnest money number 2. The home buying process can be very complex. I definitely would recommend speaking to your specific real estate agent or broker. If you're here in Asheville, I'm happy to walk you through that, but for the purposes of this video, I will just say put down the amount that you feel most comfortable with, and the higher the better in terms of a seller's eyes. Step number 5 is something that has come about a little bit more recently. I would say it's become a little more common over the past 12 months, but it's not all that common, and that is to get an appraisal waiver if that is something that your lender is offering and if that is something that you qualify for. So basically what this means is if you are getting a loan, let's say you're getting a conventional loan and you're a very well qualified buyer and you put in an offer on a house, there are some instances where the lender will actually offer you and say, hey, we actually don't need an appraisal on this one. This won't apply to every situation, but definitely talk to your lender and see if that is a possibility. Tip number 6 is offering to pay part of an appraisal gap. So what I mean by this is, let's say that the home you're looking at purchasing is listed at $400,000, but you offer $425,000, and maybe it's only going to appraise for $415,000. So there could be an appraisal gap issue there if you are planning to get a mortgage. So you could add in some language into the offer stating something like, you will pay up to $5,000 in the event of an appraisal gap. And that will give the seller a little bit of comfort knowing that if there are any appraisal issues, you are willing to step in and help pay for some of that difference. Number 7 is having as few contingencies as possible. So contingencies could be things like getting a mortgage, having a home to sell, inspections. Anything like that is considered a contingency, and it does make your offer weaker. However, it's also a protection for you. So there is some sort of balance there that you're going to need to figure out what you're most comfortable with. But in a seller's eyes, the fewer contingencies, the better. Tip number 8 is having as short of a due diligence period as possible. So a little bit earlier in the video, I mentioned due diligence fee, and I briefly mentioned the term due diligence period. So what this means is the due diligence period, let's say you have it at 2 weeks, and you're getting a few different home inspections. You are going to have those home inspections done within the due diligence period. So within that 2 weeks, you're going to have the inspections done, the reports completed, the response to the seller submitted, and any sort of negotiations that might occur done within that due diligence period. Also, if you're getting a mortgage, you'll need to have that appraisal done within that time period as well. So this is something you're really going to have to talk to your agent and your lender to figure out what a good time frame might be. I would recommend going with the shortest time frame possible though, based on what your realtor and your mortgage lender recommend and based on what you feel comfortable with. The reason for this is that the seller wants to lock you in essentially as soon as possible. So again, in your due diligence period, you can back out and get your earnest money back. But if it's after the due diligence period, you will not be able to get your earnest money back. So the quicker the seller can get you to lock in that earnest money, the better it is in their eyes. Tip number 9 is being flexible on settlement date. So a lot of times when someone wants to place an offer on a home, I will go to the listing agent and see if I can get a little bit of information on what date or what time frame might be good for the seller. If it's an estate sale situation, for example, frequently those people that are selling the estate will want to get it off of their hands as quickly as possible. So you might want to even do like a 2 or 3 week settlement if that's possible for you. That's more likely for a cash scenario. Mortgages usually would take about 30 days to close minimum. Usually 30 to 45 is typical. But there are some cases where someone might want a 2-month settlement or even 3 months if they have to move out of state or whatever their situation might be. So figuring that out and making your offer flexible to the seller's needs is very important. Tip number 10 is if you have a home that you currently need to sell in order to purchase a new one, I would recommend getting that home sold before going and looking for a new home to purchase. The reason for this is if you have that box checked on your offer stating that you have a home to sell and you need the proceeds from that home to purchase a new home, it's another contingency that the seller's going to look at and say, this isn't the strongest buyer that we can get. And unfortunately, that's just the state of the market these days. If we were in a buyer's market, it would be a little bit different, but in this very, very strong seller's market, it is much easier to purchase a home if you already have your current home sold. Yes, I know that does mean that you might have to rent for a little while, and that's not ideal for most people. We all hate moving twice if we can avoid it, but in this current market, it might be your best bet, and it might actually make your home buying time frame shorter. Tip number 11 is not asking for any seller's assist if you can avoid it. So seller's assist is basically where the seller will pay some of your closing costs for you. And this is something that can be negotiated during the due diligence period. For example, let's say there are some roof leaks and that's going to need to be handled, but you'd rather just do it after settlement, but still have the seller reimburse you some sort of amount to help you pay for that. They might give you, let's say, $2,000 towards your closing costs so that you have that money to make those repairs. But in this seller's market, I wouldn't really recommend asking for any sort of seller's assist with your initial offer. It will absolutely make your offer weaker. Of course, if it is something that you financially need in order to purchase the home, you will need to go ahead and ask for that, but if it's not absolutely needed, I would not recommend it. Tip number 12 is pretty unconventional, and it's really only started popping up recently. Prior to the past year, it was pretty rare, and that is to pay part of the seller's closing costs. So yes, I know that does sound a little bit crazy, paying part of the seller's closing costs, but it is a way to make your offer a little bit more attractive to the seller. Tip number 13 is using a local and reputable mortgage lender. So sellers will frequently look at your pre-qualification or pre-approval letter and say, hey, that's a really big bank, or hey, that's a local bank. And 9 times out of 10, the listing agent is going to tell them that it's a lot easier to work with a local lender. If you're working with a big bank and you have a 1-800 number as the contact info for that lender, it's likely going to result in delays in the transaction. Whereas if you're working with a local lender, they have the knowledge of the local market, state laws, and everything that is needed for that transaction. A lot of times if you ask them, a local lender will also reach out to the listing agent and put in a good word for you for your offer, saying that you are a very well qualified buyer, if that is the case, of course, and just add in an extra good word in hopes that it will help your offer get accepted. Tip 14 is using a local and reputable attorney for settlement. So the reason for this is basically the same reason that I mentioned using a local lender. And that is to say that if you are using an attorney that is known to cause delays in settlement or just be really difficult to work with, it's likely that the listing agent is going to mention that to the seller. And they might say, well, if they're difficult to work with, then that might just be a big headache and let's move on to the next person if it's a close offer to yours. So the key in this market is getting ahead in every little way that you can. So if you're using a reputable attorney, it's likely that the listing agent will notice that and share that information with the seller. Tip number 15 is using a trusted, knowledgeable, and prompt real estate broker. That is absolutely key in this market. You want someone that is knowledgeable about the area, knowledgeable about the contracts and the different documents that are involved in the transaction. I can't tell you how many times I see documents that are improperly filled out, or there's things where they're not protecting the buyer in certain ways where they should be. And you want someone that can explain these documents to you so that you understand where your money is going and what exactly is happening throughout the transaction. There are a couple quick things that I want to mention in this video as well that I used to recommend to my clients, but I no longer do. And they're two things that you might be aware of and might be thinking, hey, why didn't she mention those things? And they are letters and escalation clauses. So the reason I don't recommend letters anymore is that as of recent, a lot of lawsuits have actually been popping up around letters, and basically where a buyer might say, hey, well, they picked that offer over mine because their letter was better, and they talked about wanting to start a family, and I don't have the ability to start a family, or any sort of like discrimination people are starting lawsuits over in terms of these letters. So it's honestly something that a lot of brokers have stopped even accepting, and it's just not something I would recommend getting into. It doesn't really help your offer all that much, and lately, like I said, a lot of brokerages aren't even accepting them. So it's just something I would recommend staying away from. The second thing is an escalation clause, and this is not something I recommend either. Actually, in North Carolina, there is not even any sort of escalation clause document. So this was more common in Pennsylvania, where I initially started my career, but I'll briefly mention what it is here. It's basically where if you wanted to, again, let's use the same example as earlier. Let's say the house is listed at $400,000 and you are willing to pay up to $425,000. But if you use an escalation clause, you might be able to say, well, I'm going to offer you $400,000, but I'm going to offer you an escalation up to $425,000 in increments of $1,000. So in other words, if someone offers $420,000, let's say, you could get the house for $421,000. There is one big problem with this though, and that is that the seller is not legally allowed, and same with the listing agent, they're not legally allowed to share the competing offer with you. So they easily could just say, oh yeah, the other offer was $420,000 and you had to go to $421,000, whereas it might not be anywhere close. So this can ultimately result in you going to your max escalation and thinking that it was needed because there was a competing offer that was right up to yours, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the case because you'll never know. You'll never see that other offer. So that's definitely an issue, and I would say you might as well just go in at your highest and best, and that is basically going to get you the same exact result as what the escalation clause would get you anyways. So after listing all of those 15 tips, you're probably thinking, wow, the seller has a lot of power and a lot of say in this transaction, and what about me? Why, where is the power for me as a buyer? And honestly, it's true. In a seller's market, there isn't much negotiating power on the buying side. But I do want to bring something up that is very important to keep in mind when you are purchasing a home. And that is that, yes, buying a home is a huge financial decision, and I don't want to make light of that. But I know a lot of buyers think that I want to get a really good deal on a home and I want this to be a great financial investment. And yes, you don't necessarily want to overpay for a home, but there is another factor that you need to take into consideration when purchasing a home, and that is investing in your emotional well-being. Your home is someplace that is going to be completely yours. It's someplace where you're going to make memories, maybe start a family and renovate it and really make it your own space. And there are other aspects to the home other than just making a good return on your investment when you go to sell it. So these are other factors that you really have to take into consideration when purchasing a property. Financial return, of course, but also emotional return, and how happy are you going to be when you actually get that home and have your own space. That is definitely an important part of the process and an important piece to remember. I know it's tough out there, but just be patient, have faith in the process, and make sure you get yourself a good realtor to help you in that. I did want to mention quickly before I sign out this video, in case you haven't seen my other recent videos or don't follow me on social media, I do have my free home buyer guide. I will leave my contact info at the end of this video as well as in the description box. It's an 11-page home buyer guide that basically breaks down the home buying process step by step, and at the very end of the document there is a template to help you figure out what exactly you want in your next home. So if you'd like a copy of that, just reach out to me and I will be happy to email that over to you. But I think that I have chatted your ear off enough today. I really hope that you found this video helpful in some way. If you did, definitely hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you would like to see in the future, and I will see you guys very soon in the next one.